All right, let's dive in. Today we're heading to the Mediterranean, to the island of Cyprus, to explore their constitution. We're looking at the official Greek version from October 2020, and let me tell you, this document is a gold mine. It's got history, politics, and some seriously unique legal twists and turns, so get ready for a wild ride.
It's true. This constitution is unlike any other I've seen. You know, most constitutions are all about setting up a country's internal structure, the nuts and bolts. But right off the bat, the Cyprus constitution acknowledges a higher power, the European Union.
You're talking about Article 1A, right? The one where they basically say, look, if any part of this constitution clashes with what the EU says, the EU wins. It's like they're saying, EU membership, non-negotiable, we're all in.
Precisely. It really makes you think, what happens if there's a real conflict? Does Cyprus always have to bend to the EU's will, even if it means compromising their own laws? It's a pretty bold statement about where their priorities lie.
It definitely raises some questions about how much power a country gives up when it joins a larger organization, right? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This constitution is full of these kinds of fascinating details. For example, one of the things that jumped out at me was how deeply it reflects Cyprus's history. Specifically, the division between the Greek and Turkish communities.
Absolutely. Article 2 goes into great detail about this communal structure. You've got the Greek community and the Turkish community, each with its own communal assembly. Imagine having separate mini-parliaments within the larger government.
It's like a government within a government. And here's where it gets even more interesting. You can actually switch communities. It's not just about where your ancestors came from. If you want to officially change your affiliation, there's a formal process for that.
You got it. It's all laid out in Article 2. Though there are some, let's say, traditional elements, like the part that says a married woman automatically belongs to her husband's community. It definitely reflects a different era when it comes to individual choices.
Yeah, it makes you think about how societies change and whether those old rules still hold up today. Speaking of evolving, the Constitution lays out all those fundamental rights we expect. Freedom of movement, freedom of expression, protection from discrimination. But then there are some exceptions that really caught my eye.
You're talking about things like Article 9, right? The one that allows for detention without a warrant in cases of flagrant offenses. It makes you wonder, what exactly is flagrant? Could that be open to interpretation, maybe even abuse?
It definitely sounds a bit vague, doesn't it? Like, who gets to decide what crosses the line? This is why the details really matter. And speaking of details, let's talk about how power is actually shared in Cyprus. Articles 36 through 49 lay out this intricate dance between the president, who has to be Greek, and the vice president, who has to be Turkish. And it gets really specific, like down to who gets to attend what events.
It is incredible how much detail they put into making sure both communities have a voice. For instance, the vice president has the right to be at all official events, according to Article 38. It's not enough to just have the position. They wanted to guarantee visibility, too.
It's like they were building in safeguards from the very beginning, making sure neither side felt sidelined. And it's not just about these two leaders. They took that same meticulous approach when setting up the House of Representatives, their version of Parliament.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets mind-boggling. Article 62 says the number of representatives from each community is fixed. It doesn't change even if the population shifts.
Wait, seriously. So even if, say, way more people from one community moved to Cyprus, the representation wouldn't change. That's crazy.
It sounds counterintuitive, but that's how they built it. They were so focused on maintaining balance that they essentially froze the representation in time. It makes you wonder how well that works in practice, right?
Right. I mean, it's one thing to write it down, but how does that play out in the real world decades later? It's like they were trying to prevent any kind of power grab even before it could happen.
It speaks to the level of distrust that probably existed back then, doesn't it? They weren't willing to risk one community dominating the other, even if demographics changed. And speaking of checks and balances, we haven't even touched on all those independent officers they put in place to keep things running smoothly.
You mean like the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General, who have to consult each other on everything related to their respective communities, even before making a decision. It's checks and balances on top of checks and balances. It's like they were obsessed with fairness.
They certainly built a system where everyone has to be at the table, and no one person or group gets to call all the shots.
So we've got this communal structure with its own quirks. We've got fundamental rights with some interesting exceptions, and we've got power sharing down to a science. But we're just getting started. What else does this Constitution have in store for us? So we've talked about how power is divided at the top, But what about those communal assemblies we mentioned earlier? They have way more power than you might think, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking serious autonomy here. Articles 86 through 107 outline their powers. And it's not just symbolic stuff. They control things like education, religion, even personal status laws.
Wait, personal status laws? Like, what does that even mean?
Think about the big life events, marriage, divorce, inheritance. Those are all governed by personal status laws. And in Cyprus, each community gets to decide those rules for its members.
Whoa, so imagine you have two people from different communities who want to get married, whose laws apply. That's got to make things complicated.
You're catching on. It creates this really unique legal landscape where two different sets of rules are operating side by side. It definitely raises questions about how disputes are resolved and what happens when those different laws clash.
Yeah, I can see how that could lead to some interesting legal battles.
Yeah.
But it also shows how seriously they take the idea of separate communities, right? It's not just about having different representatives in parliament. It's about having real control over aspects of your life that are deeply personal and cultural.
Exactly. And it goes even further than that. Article 92 allows for the establishment of separate communal police forces. Can you imagine living in a place where, depending on your community, you have a different police force responsible for your safety?
That's wild. It's like they took the idea of separate but equal and really ran with it. You know, it's making me think about how much we take for granted the idea of a unified legal system. In Cyprus, they've built this whole structure where two distinct systems coexist.
It's a fascinating experiment in power sharing and accommodating different cultural and legal traditions. And they don't stop there. They even created a supreme constitutional court to make sure everyone plays by the rules, including the communities themselves.
Oh yeah, that court sounds like it has a ton of power. It can review laws to make sure they don't violate the Constitution and even settle disputes between different branches of government. Talk about checks and balances.
It's like they anticipated that there would be conflicts and disagreements, and they wanted a clear mechanism for resolving them. Article 137 gives the court the power to strike down laws that don't align with the Constitution, which is a pretty big deal.
So if Parliament tries to pass a law that oversteps its bounds, this court can just say, nope, try again?
Exactly. They're the ultimate arbiters of what's constitutionally permissible, and they also act as a referee when different parts of the government can't agree on who has the authority to do what. Article 139 gives them that power.
Wow, so they're not just making sure laws are fair, they're making sure the whole system runs smoothly. It's like they designed this Constitution to anticipate every possible problem. Speaking of anticipating problems, there's one part of this document that really threw me for a loop. It has to do with marriage and divorce, and it's one of the most unusual things I've ever seen in a legal text.
You're talking about Article 111, right? The one that says divorce for members of the Greek Orthodox Church is governed by church law, as it stood in 1989.
Yes. It's like they took a snapshot of religious doctrine and made it legally binding. So even if the church changes its stance on divorce today, those changes wouldn't automatically apply to Greek Cypriots.
That's the way it reads. It's a fascinating example of how religion and law can intersect in unexpected ways. And it gets even more complex because the article also says other religious groups have their own family courts, and civil marriage is an option for Greek Cypriots too.
Talk about a complicated legal landscape. It makes you wonder how all these different systems interact and what happens when they collide. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces from different boxes.
It definitely highlights the challenges of creating a legal framework that accommodates diverse beliefs and practices. And keep in mind, this Constitution hasn't stayed frozen in time. It's gone through a number of amendments over the years.
Right, like the one where they had to change their extradition laws to comply with EU requirements. It's right there in the preamble to the Seventh Amendment. It's a pretty clear example of how international commitments can force a country to revise its own laws, even if those laws are a part of their constitution.
It shows how the balance of power can shift even after a constitution is written. You've got internal pressures and external pressures, and sometimes those forces pull in different directions, and sometimes a country has to make tough choices about which set of rules takes priority.
And then there's Article 183, which allows the government to temporarily suspend certain parts of the Constitution during a state of emergency. That seems like a lot of power to give to any government, doesn't it?
It's a double-edged sword, for sure. On the one hand, you can see why they'd want that flexibility in times of crisis. But on the other hand, it does raise concerns about potential abuses of power. Who gets to decide what constitutes an emergency, and what's to stop them from using that power to erode people's rights?
It's a dilemma that a lot of countries grapple with. How do you balance security and freedom, especially when things get chaotic? But you know what? Even with all these complexities and potential pitfalls, there's one thing about the Cyprus Constitution that really impresses me: the focus on financial safeguards.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those things that often gets overlooked, but those financial provisions are crucial for maintaining stability and preventing abuses of power.
So what kind of financial safeguards are we talking about? What do they build into this thing?
Well, let's start with something simple but powerful. Article 80. It basically says you can't raise taxes without passing a separate law specifically for that purpose. You can't just slip a tax hike into some unrelated bill and hope nobody notices.
So no sneaky tax increases. They have to be upfront about it.
Transparency is key. It forces the government to be accountable and prevents them from burdening people with taxes without a clear justification. It makes you wonder if other countries could learn from this approach.
I mean, imagine if our government had to pass a separate law every time they wanted to raise taxes. It might lead to some interesting debates. But there's more to it than just taxes, right? The budget process itself is designed to protect that balance between the two communities.
That's right. Article 167 requires the annual budget to include specific provisions for the needs of each community. It's not just about splitting the money down the middle. It's about recognizing that each community has unique priorities and challenges that need to be addressed.
So it's like they're trying to make sure neither community feels like they're getting shortchanged, financially speaking. It's another example of that obsession with fairness we've been seeing throughout this whole Constitution.
It's baked into the very structure of their financial system, and let's not forget the part that gives the House of Representatives its own separate budget.
Oh yeah, Article 167 mentions that. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, think about it. If the legislature has to rely on the executive branch for funding, it creates a potential for manipulation. The executive could withhold funding to pressure the legislature into passing certain laws, but by giving the House its own independent budget, they've removed that leverage.
So the legislature can't be bullied into doing things they don't want to do just because their funding is on the line. It's like they built in a safety net to protect their own independence.
Exactly. It's another example of how carefully they considered the potential for abuse of power and took steps to prevent it. They were really trying to create a system where everyone is accountable and no one gets to act like a dictator.
You know, it's easy to get lost in all the technical details, but when you step back and look at the big picture, it's pretty impressive how much thought went into designing this Constitution. They were dealing with a really complex situation with a lot of potential for conflict, and they tried to anticipate every possible scenario.
They were building a system for a divided island, and they knew that trust would be a major issue. So they created this incredibly intricate framework with all these checks and balances and safeguards, all in the name of fairness and stability.
It's like they were saying, we know we don't always see eye to eye, but let's at least agree on the rules of the game so we can avoid chaos.
And those rules are still in play today, shaping the way Cyprus functions as a country. Of course, no system is perfect, and there are bound to be challenges and disagreements. But the fact that they managed to create this framework at all, and that it's still largely intact, is pretty remarkable.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the powers of the president and vice president to the unique role of communal assemblies and the importance of financial safeguards. But there's one last piece of the puzzle we need to discuss. How has this Constitution held up over time? Has it been able to adapt to a changing world? And what lessons can we learn from Cyprus's experience? You know, it's amazing to think about this whole Constitution with all its intricacies and safeguards. It was crafted back in the 1960s. The world has changed so much since then, hasn't it? It makes you wonder how well those original ideas have held up over time.
It is a great question. And I think the answer is, well, it's complicated. On the one hand, the Constitution has proven remarkably resilient. I mean, it survived a major crisis in the 1970s, and it's still the framework that governs the country today. That's a testament to the foresight of those who drafted it. But on the other hand, no document can anticipate every challenge, and the Cyprus Constitution has definitely been put to the test over the years.
Right, like we talked about how they had to amend their extradition laws to comply with EU requirements. That's a pretty big deal, changing your constitution to fit in with a larger organization. It makes you wonder what other tensions might have arisen between Cyprus's internal structure and its international commitments.
It's a constant balancing act, and I think you see that tension play out in a lot of countries that are part of larger organizations like the EU. You want to maintain your sovereignty and protect your own interests, but you also want to reap the benefits of cooperation and integration. It's not always an easy equation to solve.
And then there's the whole issue of the divided island. The Constitution was designed to create a power-sharing system between the Greek and Turkish communities. But that division is still a major factor in Cypriot politics and society. Has the Constitution helped to bridge that divide? Or has it just reinforced it?
That's a question that scholars and politicians have been debating for decades, and there's no easy answer. Some argue that the Constitution's emphasis on separate communal structures has actually made it harder to achieve true unity. It's like they're living in two parallel worlds, each with its own laws and institutions.
So instead of bringing people together, it's actually kept them apart.
That's one way of looking at it. But others argue that the Constitution has been essential for maintaining peace and stability on the island. It's provided a framework for managing differences and preventing conflict, which is no small feat given the history of violence and mistrust.
So it's a trade-off, stability at the expense of true unity.
Perhaps. It's a delicate balance, and the situation is constantly evolving, but one thing's for sure. The Cyprus Constitution is a fascinating case study in the challenges of building a democracy in a divided society.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about. This whole deep dive has been a roller coaster ride. From those super specific power-sharing rules to the mind-boggling idea of separate police forces. And the way religion is woven into the legal fabric. It's like looking into a mirror of another world, one with its own unique logic and challenges.
It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all model for democracy. What works in one country might not work in another, and every system has its strengths and weaknesses. The key is to be aware of those complexities, and to be constantly looking for ways to adapt and improve.
So for you, the listener, the big takeaway here is that constitutions are more than just dusty old documents. They're living, breathing frameworks that shape the way societies function. And they're constantly being tested and challenged by internal and external forces. The Cyprus Constitution is a particularly vivid example of that. And it offers some valuable lessons about the complexities of power sharing, the importance of safeguards, and the enduring legacy of history.
It also highlights the fact that democracy is a journey, not a destination. It's a process of constant negotiation and failures.
And who knows? Maybe by taking a deep dive into this unique and complex system, we can gain a better understanding of our own systems and the challenges we face. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deeper. That's what the deep dive is all about.